New York. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Kawar, over to you.
Thank you, Anthony. It's really great to partner once again with our friends from the UK on such an important topic. Canada is proud of the cooperation between our two countries in keeping attention on media freedom issues. It's been inspiring to witness the work of many dedicated partners who are raising their voices and pushing governments to really do more. This past weekend, I was really happy to read, for example, about the independent panel of legal experts on media freedom, which released a report authored by former Canadian Minister of Justice Irwin Cotler, in which he called for a charter of rights for detained journalists. I think at the time of our first global media conference a year and a half ago now, none of us could have predicted the awfulness that 2020 would bring. But what's been encouraging throughout this has been the role that a free press has brought to the many dimensions of this pandemic, including its disproportionate impact on women, people of color, and poorer economic groups. The collision of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic with a reckoning on systemic racism has really illustrated the need for independent media to provide timely, accurate information that holds the government and indeed all of us to account. It shone a spotlight on particularly on the failure of newsrooms to fully reflect their communities, to build a culture of inclusion and to foster equity at all levels. As the great American, actually, I always say Canadian is the default here at the Consul General, but as the great American investigative journalist Ida B. Wells said, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And I think that one of the upsides of the discussion that we're all having around systemic racism and discrimination is that it brings out civic leaders to share and inspire with their stories. As a basketball fan, I was heartened to read one of my childhood heroes, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. His statement really resonated with me, and when he said that racism, he likened racism to dust in the air and said, it seems invisible, even if you're choking on it, until you let the sun in. Then you see it everywhere. I think, the Getting to the Truth series aims to help and contribute to do that. Just like our first two discussions on the threats of disinformation and the importance of local news, this event is centered around the core tenet that journalism is a vital public service. And if we hold that tenet to be true, then we need to be serious about tackling how journalism can be intentional about serving and representing everyone, particularly those who are closest to the biggest challenges society faces. Oh, just a sec. Sorry, I don't know, I've lost my spot here. Just a sec. Gee whiz. So through this course of, this requires more, of course, than panel discussion. It requires effective and enforced policies backed by substantial resources. As an example of this, Canada has recently announced an investment of $50 million for 5 years to specifically support local journalism. The Local Journalism Initiative allows underserved communities to have strong local coverage. The horrific murder of George Floyd ignited a reckoning in the United States, but also in Canada too, and forced us to look at ourselves in the mirror as a society and confront the racial inequalities that still exist and persist in our society. Our forward approach should be anchored in an acknowledgement that systemic racism runs through our history, and its legacy is still being felt across all facets of society, including in our media. Many Canadian journalists of color have spoken out about racial indignities suffered at Canadian outlets over the decades. As a Canadian of color myself, I've been moved by the courage of their conviction to share their personal stories in fighting systemic racism. Journalists like Adrienne Harewood, Kayla Gray, and of course Shri Paradkar, who I'm excited will be joining us today. Finally, we're honored to partner with Resolve Philly for this event and to be able to connect with the community in Philadelphia, a city I love and admire deeply. I mentioned basketball. I am a closet Iverson fan, but the work of Resolve Philly and its commitment to experimentation, innovation, and collaboration really reflects what the city of sisterly love is all about. And I would now like to hand it over to our moderator, Cassie Haynes, Co-Executive Director of Resolve Philly. Cassie is a leading voice in Philadelphia and has a fascinating background in community organizing, public policy, venture capital, and strategic planning. And we're very fortunate and grateful to have her today to moderate this discussion. Over to you, Cassie.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. In 2020, the collision of the COVID-19 pandemic with the reckoning on deep and entrenched systemic racism has upended societies. And it's also created a moment of reflection within newsrooms and across the journalism industry. It's reignited discussions about what it means to create truly equitable, inclusive, diverse, and indeed anti-racist newsrooms that can cover the news of the day as well as report the stories that are meaningful to the communities they serve. We also know that it has to go beyond discussions. My guests today are exciting folks who represent different outlets in different countries. Joining me is Anne Alexander. Anne joins from Good Morning Britain. Shri Pradakar from Toronto Star, and Hassani Gittins from The City. I'm curious to hear from all of you, what are some of the conversations that are happening in your newsrooms right now? How are your newsrooms attempting to create more equitable structures? And then we'll take a break and define equity. And go ahead and please speak a little bit about your work and some of the projects that you're engaged in right now.
I can start if you like. I'm actually quite proud. I work for ITV. Good Morning Britain is part of the ITV family. Now, ITV actually launched its diversity acceleration plan this year. And part of that plan, it's a wide range of things that they're working on to improve diversity in the newsroom and also in the wider ITV family. I mean, one of the things they've done, which I think is really significant, they actually have a diversity champion sitting on the board of ITV. So we're talking about top management here. They're really, really serious about it. And I'm really proud of that, because I think the way that ITV has responded to everything that's been happening this year, it's been more than just words. They've actually done something solid about it. So they've got a diversity champion actually sitting on the board. They have various programs which are aimed specifically at improving and accelerating careers for underrepresented groups within ITV. It involves apprenticeships. It involves a scheme where people who show potential get onto an accelerated management scheme. So they are doing practical things. I mean, there are things going on anyway, but I think everything that's happened this year with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter in particular has accelerated things. So there are some actual physical things going on. And also there's a commitment to improve diversity on screen, because ITV obviously on screen journalism, as well as behind the scenes as well. So actually within my organisation, you've got all these things going on, but also within that, interestingly, the conversation has really expanded. We're not just talking about our senior managers making commitment to improve on-screen and off-screen diversity. Colleagues are speaking about it all the time, and they're kind of approaching people like me to say, actually, I'm slightly worried about this. Am I using the right term? Can I speak to you about this? How can I help you? How can I be a good advocate? So I have to say, I've just only got positive things to say about the organisation that I'm working for, and I'm really happy to say that. And not just that, there have been certain things which have happened recently. We had an incident where we had some complaints about a particular report that went out, and there were lots of people saying that they were upset about that people had brought up the Black Lives Matter incident, and ITV were very, very strong and vociferous, and they said, actually, no, we support Black Lives Matter, and that we think we were right to do what we did. So I think it's very, very positive to say in terms of the organisation that I'm working for at the moment on all levels.
That's awesome to hear. You mentioned accelerated management schemes, and we're going to come back to talk a little bit more about pipeline and talent development, internships, fellowships, et cetera. Shri, could you introduce yourself, please? Oh, my friend, you're on mute. There you go.
I'm on mute. I've only ever seen other people do it, and now I've fallen for this. So yeah, I'm Shri Paradkar. I am a race and gender columnist at the Toronto Star, and also recently made an internal ombud, which segues us nicely into the discussion on hand, which is on racial reckoning, because this new position or the additional position came directly in response to that reckoning that we are having globally around whatever oppressive structures that our societies operate in. I'm a little bit more cynical about everything around me, although I work in an organization where we are founded on the principles of social justice. There is actually a mission statement that privileges social justice. And so I would say in many ways, we are ahead of the curve in understanding where we have to be. What you said earlier, Cassie, about being anti-racist organizations, I would venture forth to say that in Canada, we're still not even at non-racist. So it's a step to go from non-racist to anti-racist. And I'm not sure that newsrooms are even at non-racist places. So I see industry-wide, I see this as a very long journey. I see it as very much at the beginning stages, which is surprising because really this, it's not as if racism is something new and we are just discovering it now. And so I withhold a lot of, parts of me feel very enthusiastic, but I do withhold it until there is some longevity to the changes that we are talking about. In our industry, we've always been in a bit of an existential crisis even before COVID, but we saw it more as a financial problem, a technological crisis, battling information overload, battling misinformation. But then now, finally, there is this greater, I would like to think, tectonic shift happening, an internal struggle. Because now as an industry, we are grappling with our own role and trying to, we've been trying so hard to avoid this subject. We've been the outsiders talking about how racism is happening in society, but now we're having to reckon with our own complicity in these oppressive structures. And some of us, some organizations remain in denial. Some continue to dismiss the need for this. Oh, everyone is too sensitive. And a few are taking active steps. I'm proud to belong to an organization that is taking active steps. We are trying to grapple with, the idea that at a fundamental level, capitalism cannot be aligned with social justice, right? Like it's not a natural partner. So how do you have those very opposing principles living in tension with each other? You're a profit or a for-profit organization, but you also you're also talking about social justice. How do you make that happen? And it's a very conformist industry. And so now, when we talk about journalism as speaking truth to power, but what if we are the power? And who's going to hold us accountable? And so we're talking about major structural issues. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of them. But yeah, I just, in my introduction, wanted to say that my new job itself is part of that structural improvement.
Thank you. We will definitely get into those. It's also fascinating to hear that the Toronto Star has social justice incorporated into its mission statement. At some point, maybe circling back to that, that is an interesting structure at its core, right? What happens when social justice is part of that mission? Hassani.
Hi, thank you for having me again. I'm really just coming back because I want a knighthood eventually. But at the city, the city, for anyone who doesn't know, is in New York City. We launched April 2019, or we started publishing actually in maybe February 2019. And we're probably about a 20-person newsroom. I'm a deputy editor. There's another deputy editor, and there's an editor-in-chief, and we're the 3 editors who pretty much edit everything. We also have an engagement editor and a photo editor. And from the beginning, we were like, our kind of mission is, getting the people's voice in there. We're a nonprofit. We let anyone reprint anything we have, as long as they do it in a responsible way and use our pictures. So in a way, we were always kind of just wanting to be part of the people, the community. Our kind of, we have several kind of missions and slogans, but one of them is listen, dig, deliver. And we always want to kind of have, we tend to want to always start with people in a story, and then policy, and then data. And when you look at people, I think that you can't help but try to be a little bit more humane and understanding of the struggles that people, of all colors go through. And in this city, in this country, the people who are struggling the most happen to be people of color. So we, talk about them a lot, and a lot of the disparities that are going on. And we're extremely focused on, police brutality. We've done a lot of stories on maternal mortality, on education disparities, special education disparities, and all those kind of things. So we, even coming into this year, like our first story ever was about the 20th anniversary of Amadou Diallo being shot. And so coming into this, we were like, we do this. This is what we're focused on. But then with the protests, George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and everything that happened, including in our own backyard, the kind of the final reckoning, kind of, or lack of reckoning for the Eric Garner case that was 5 years ago that really didn't even get resolved in a kind of satisfactory way. We were thinking, okay, this is what we do, but how do we do it better? How do we do more? How do we be more proactive about it? And so, like, out the gate last year, we had a diversity report, but we were like, okay, we're going to do that again. And I was proud to be someone who insisted that this year we actually included our board of directors in the diversity report, which I thought was very important, because there's a lot of places that are run or mostly staffed by people of color, but then the people behind it, the board, the people giving the money, are all white, and then they kind of control your destiny a little bit. But we also went farther than that, and we kind of just wrote this whole kind of just diversity mission statement in a way. And a lot of it is focused on the pipeline. And one of the things that we're doing right now is really trying to focus more on helping mentoring high school kids. We're just kind of starting that with some organizations in New York to really just make sure that more people have an opportunity to even get in this business. Our internship previously was not officially, but kind of restricted to Columbia J School kids and City University J School kids. And that, already cuts out a whole bunch of people who can't afford or don't have access to that sort of privilege. So we're trying to expand that. We're trying to do more mentoring in general. And, just every day, I think we think about, I definitely think about just how the words that we use affect people. And I think that's something that, like this year, AP and the Times and NBC and us too, decided to capitalize Black, which was kind of a big deal in copy editing circles. And that's just one thing, though. That's just like one blatantly obvious thing. And there's so many other things there. And that's why, not to get ahead of myself, but that's why it's like representation matters so much, because you need people in the room, and not just in the room, but literally doing the editing or doing the publishing or doing the reporting, that understand how these words affect our communities, and somebody can be very, noble-minded and good-hearted and well-intentioned, but if they're not from the community, or they at least don't have more experience with the community that they're reporting on, that they're trying to help, they just kind of come across as a white savior sometimes, and and are still kind of maybe rubbing people the wrong way with the kind of words that they're using. We had a story that was, not about race at all, and honestly, the people who did it may or may not have been people of color, but it was a very popular story we had today about this train that was completely, 24 trains that were completely graffitied in the subway overnight. Obviously it's nice pictures and it's just crazy and it's a talker, but in the lead, and and the reporter is Latino, but in the lead, he called the people vandals, and I was like, let's not criminalize them right out the gate, and that's just the kind of thing that I think needs to be thought about a little bit more in journalism. There's so many little things that are killing us.
Amen. I mean, language is exceptionally powerful. And I think as, I'm putting this in air quotes, but as gatekeepers, information and shepherds of language, I think journalists wield an exceptional power, right, when it comes to language. Shri.
Just wanted to jump in on this very important point on capitalizing B for Black, which, it's, I'm proud to say that at the Star, we did it in 2016. I'm proud to say it's 2016 only because although that's terrifically late, it's a little bit before. We didn't need this racial reckoning for that to happen. But what I'd like to see is how did, for those who are not journalists in the audience, we have, the Associated Press has a style book. Many organizations follow that style book. In Canada, we also have the Canadian Press style book. These, and written by grammarians, people with very, who are sensitive to the language. How was it that for centuries or decades, there has been this request from Black communities, and forgive me, I don't mean to speak for anybody, I'm just placing this as a point of discussion, that for so many decades, Black people have been saying you need to capitalize B for Black, or even as W.E.B. Du Bois said, N for Negro, because that has become an identity that's been foisted on people and it deserves to be capitalized, just as South Asian might be capitalized. That how was it that a style book could be seen as more important than what people who are actually affected by this style are saying about themselves, and what it means to the disrespect that lack of capital B or capital I for Indigenous is actually doing for the people. And so you can imagine how callous we've been, and whose voices, it's all very well after the racial reckoning to say, oh, we'll now give you capital B for Black. Well, okay, good, but slow clap, because whose voices have you been dismissing all this time? So, yeah.
I appreciate that point. And go ahead.
Can I just pick up on what Shri was talking about, the B for Black? So there's quite a lot of talk in the UK at the moment about the term BAME, Black and Minority Ethnic. Now, I personally don't like the term BAME, and a lot of other Black people don't like the term BAME either, because it feels like we're being lumped into this kind of like this huge kind of lump of people. I mean, as if that I am the same as my Nigerian friend, or my mixed heritage friend, or my Southeast Asian friend. We are all very, very different, and there is a real move against this term BAME, but it's kind of something which has been used as almost like an administrative tool for quite a long time. And we're at this point now in the UK where we're trying to find out what the term ought to be that everyone feels comfortable with. I mean, I personally just like to refer to myself as Black. And, I've got friends who are from different ethnicities who refer to themselves as brown or in other ways. And I think it's really important that people listen to how people like me want to be referred. I am not BAME. I'm not this kind of this huge block. I am not the same as my Nigerian friends or my Indian friends or my Pakistani friends. We're all very much individual. I mean, even within the Caribbean, I'm Caribbean heritage. The islands are all so very, very different. So I think I just wanted just to talk about, that the way that people are used and described. And can I also just jump back to something that Hassani was talking about? I think you were going to probably go on to this next anyway. I'm not sure, Cassie, but you mentioned about internships. I have a huge bugbear about unpaid internships for the same reason as you. Basically, it cuts out poor kids. If you can't afford to spend 5-6 weeks of your life or even longer working for free, how do you get that really important work experience to get your foot in the door for your first job? And I was looking at some stats before we started this, and the Sutton Trust, which is an organisation in the UK which works for social mobility, they did some research around this, and apparently last year there was something like 58,000 unpaid internships which were carried out by various people at various organisations, and around half of them were at least 4 weeks long. Now, who can afford to work for free as a young person unless you have the backing of rich relatives to look after you? So I've got a real strong commitment to, if you're going to have an internship, you make sure that they are paid. And I don't just mean paying for some poor kid to get like the train in and out of your office. Actually pay them for their time, because they're not just sitting there doing nothing. They are helping out and they're actually contributing to your organization. And that is a really important way of people who don't have contacts or don't have the money and the resources of actually getting a foot in the door for to start off their careers. And sorry for jumping the gun there, Cassie. I was just thinking about it when Hassani just mentioned it there.
This conversation should just go wherever it needs to go. I can jump in here right now with a little bit of a grounding definition. When it comes to the title of this session is Getting to the Truth, Building Structural Equity in Journalism. And so I want to be able to kind of root us in a shared definition of what we're talking about when we're talking about structures, and then also what makes those structures equitable. So at Resolve, we do a lot of work around structural equity, and we look at structure as being the people first, the governance and money, and then the policies, practices, and workflow that make up your organization. We know that an equitable structure is one that acknowledges the potency and diversity of belonging, embraces the complexity as, embraces complexity as a reason for collaboration, recognizes individuals as experts and thought leaders, demands honesty and transparency, and calls out racism and oppression, both overt and systemic, and builds power and momentum towards achieving goals while encouraging the grace and humility to sustain the endeavor. This is based on a definition of equity that was developed by PolicyLink, which is a US social justice oriented policy lab experiment think tank. They do awesome stuff. So they worked really hard on this definition of equity, and so we took it and applied it to structures. And so when I'm talking about equity in structures, this is what I'm talking about. I wanna shift a little bit. Shri, I heard you this morning on the Toronto Star's podcast, This Matters, talking about cyber misogyny and online violence against women, and specifically women of color. What few solutions I'm aware of put the burden on the woman, put the burden on the person who has experienced that vile online violence. And I'm wondering, I mean, if we're thinking about structural equity, right, and these structures that are in place to support the people who are carrying out your work as a newsroom, what should newsrooms be doing as employers? What are some of the solutions that you might know of that I don't? How can newsrooms as employers support their employees, specifically their women employees, specifically their women of color employees? And I'm using employees, maybe I'm speaking that into existence because I also know that our industry abuses independent contractor relationships, at least in the United States. And so there's a relationship there and a duty there when we're talking about an employer and an employee relationship that doesn't exist when we're talking about independent contractors, which is another element of structural equity. But I'm curious, what can institutions do?
Thanks for asking, Cassie, and also for listening to the podcast. I'll speak a little bit to my experience and then take it, to a larger place from there, which is that I have always, ever since I've been writing about race, and I'm sure everybody else here will identify with it, you get a ton of hate mail. I've got, anytime I talked about Black Lives Matter, I talked about Muslim rights, refugee rights, and sometimes about indigenous, but mostly it's I find saying anything that supports Muslim rights. And I get this hate mail, this horrendous hate mail, I hope your husband rapes you. I hope, go back to, the country, the ugly country you came from. It's a third world latrine. It's so anyway, I want to get into the sort of threats, and then what you have to do to counter that. And so the first thing as a recipient, I would say, And I'm not the largest recipient. I think women who are much more in the public eye, namely on television and radio, are far worse sort of recipients of this kind of abuse. And so I would say that I think most women, first of all, battle with trying to be professional, and therefore, and in an industry or in a patriarchal society, still realizing that even mentioning this abuse as being disturbing could be seen as a sign of weakness. Then there is also the hesitation to take this forward because you don't want to make a scene. This fear that you might be dismissed. The idea that, journalists, we are tough people, we are, seasoned people who see life's, terrible things, and we just carry on undaunted, and we are not, weak at all. And so then the idea that you're told to toughen up, or to just ignore it. It's not a big deal. We all have to face it. Right. So, and I've in various places, I've heard that said, we all face something, so big deal. Well, different people handle abuse differently. So we can't have that one template of assumption that everybody just needs to grow thick skin. So first of all, I would say any organization that has a toughen up or ignore it approach should be setting off alarm bells of, that you're not only ignoring abuse, you're not only gaslighting the person's experience of abuse, but you're also allowing that abuse then to continue unfettered. So that's the low bar, but that still happens. So that has to be out of the way. Once you acknowledge that abuse is a problem, and there are studies, the International Consortium of Journalists, they did a big survey of 1,200 women, and they found across the globe, and they found almost 3/4, 73% said they do face online abuse, offline abuse, harassment, threats. And as we know, journalists have also been killed in the last few years in the course of their duty. And just for comparison, in 2014, a survey of 1,000 women found that about 23% of women face this kind of abuse. So it's accelerating, it's really escalating. So we have to, it's no longer just, some of us face abuse. It is that more and more we are facing abuse, and online abuse that also threatens to go offline. So once we acknowledge that, then we have to have protocols in place for complaining to police. We have to have independently some sort of a discussion on what meets police threshold for to consider this a threat or a hate crime. Does an email specifically have to say, I have your address and I'm going to come to your house and kill you? Is that the only threshold? Or can all of that cumulative effect also be seen and understood to be a threat? Because you don't know which one of these people is going to lose it. You don't know who of all of those is going to be a real threat. So there has to be that discussion with the police as well. And then, the ability for the company to block off emails from the server. You ban those emails. People with those emails don't get to write to you at all. Complaining to the emails themselves. Last week, I was, a colleague of mine was the recipient of a lot of this email, so I took it up. There's an escalation chain. We have a whole protocol in place. And, and so our public editor gets involved as well. And he writes to Gmail, he writes to Proton Mail, wherever these emails are coming from, telling them there was this abuse. And they usually respond saying, yeah, okay, we've banned this. Of course, people who want to abuse you can keep opening new emails, but now you're making it a bit more of a pain for them to do so. You also have filters. And then a big thing is mental and emotional support for the person receiving this abuse. You let them know they're not alone. And then Reuters, I think, as far as I know, is the only one that has this, or at least is the best known for peer-to-peer consultation, peer-to-peer counseling, sorry. And they are trained, peers who volunteer are trained on how to be listeners and to know, what kind of advice to give and what next steps they should take. And I understand there are some 60 people trained, and I think this is a wonderful first step for people to take. And with all of this, if all of this is done, we still wouldn't have acknowledged or understood the specific and particular kind of abuse that women of color face. And so, because there is women of color who are struggling with racism and misogyny inside the workplace, outside the workplace, not taken seriously in the newsroom, having difficulty finding their stories taken seriously there, and then finding a particular racist and particular sexualized violence directed towards them by readers or by viewers or listeners. And that's when the newspaper or the news organization has to seriously consider what other content is it carrying that is encouraging these readers or listeners or viewers to respond with that kind of abuse. And I think that's a larger conversation around, that anti-racism piece that we have to talk about.
Hassani, I saw you go off mute. Did you
No,
want
I was just to add, what about our publication makes those kind of jerks want to read us in the first place? Like, why are they even here? And I would also add that, especially coming from NBC and places like that, they have gigantic, teams of legal people, and yet they don't use them for these type of situations. And there's a lot of things that they could do to kind of almost re-harass, or not necessarily harass, but like to really push the people who are harassing and just make them realize it's not worth getting involved with this gigantic corporation. But a lot of times, women who work at these giant corporations, it feels like they're on their own, like they don't have a giant corporation behind them whatsoever.
Shri, one of the things that stood out to me, I was just taking a lot of notes on what you're saying, but the idea that there's a public editor who will write to these, email servers and take action. Obviously there's ways to circumvent that, but that to me sounds like a pretty substantial investment from leadership and a pretty substantial commitment from the leadership to say this is not something that we tolerate, and to not just say this is not something that we tolerate, but in practice, in policy, in this person's job description, this is how we address that. That seems pretty tremendous to me. And I'm wondering, I think leadership, is kind of the end all be all, right? I think if there's not a culture among the newsroom leadership of really fostering a place of belonging, that's not going to be reflected in the structure. And if it's not reflected in the structure, then it's just window dressing, right? So I'm wondering if other folks have some comments on, examples of, I think that's an excellent example of strong leadership that supports this. How can we get that in other places?
I just wanted to jump in, and I don't know whether I can contribute anything in terms of anything like that I know of that exists, say, for example, in the organisation where I work. But I know one of the things that really struck me were the concerns about young and upcoming Black female journalists who are worried about putting themselves out there on screen or as leader writers or what have you, because they're worried about the abuse that they know they will attract. So I'll give you an example. Diane Abbott, who is a very well-known UK politician. She was the first Black female MP. She was elected in the 1980s. Very, very well known, was on the Labour front bench for some years. Amnesty International did some analysis from the 2017 general election. And of all the abusive tweets that they analysed that were directed at women, half of them were directed at Diane Abbott, who is this Black female. Now, I know myself personally, I now work behind the scenes in television. I used to be on air 15 years ago, before Twitter really became a thing. I have had a couple of opportunities to go back on air in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, which I have turned down. And I'm ashamed to say that one of the reasons why I decided not to go back on air was because I do not want to put up with the kind of abuse that you attract. If people see this Black woman who has a Black country accent, it's a Midlands accent, which they're not used to. And I know that even as somebody who has a Twitter account and who works behind the scenes, same as Shri was saying, if I mention anything to do with race, you immediately get the whataboutery. What about this? What about that? Oh, you know, I don't see colour, and why are you talking about this? I'm sick of people talking about this. So it does worry me that young people who are trying to get into the industry, young women in particular, are being put off. And again, that's another one of the things which are probably holding back this whole heap of talent who ought to be out there, but they're holding back, and they can see what happens to other people who do put themselves out there.
Yeah, this is why it would be good just for companies to just make an example of the harassers more often, so that the young people and everybody coming up can see like, oh, there's hope. Somebody will have my back. But it's, you know, difficult. Or it's not difficult, they just don't do it.
It's difficult. I mean, I know that this slightly off on a tangent, but there have been cases, Sheree was mentioned about sometimes when the online abuse becomes something in real life. You know, there was a case last week where there was a journalist who was abused online, and then the abuser actually went to confront her at court because he recognized her, and she was reporting on a case of somebody else who'd been abused by an online abuser. And we've had several cases where female politicians have had to go to court again because somebody online has made threats and has said, right, I actually have your address, and you know, I'm going to come and and they've made threats of sexual violence. So some people have been made an example of, but there are the little microaggressions that happen, you know, the little things. Like I wrote an article about diversity in political journalism not so long ago, and one of my colleagues, who is a presenter, she's white and blonde hair, this is significant to the story, she retweeted my article, and there was this one particular man who for I think 3 or 4 days just kept on replying and copying myself and Sophie into his reply, saying, this black woman, me, is jealous of you because she's black and you're white and you're blonde and you're pretty. She hates herself. And it was nothing that you would ever want to go to the police about, but the little digs, that chip and chip and chip and chip away. And I sat there thinking, I didn't regret that I'd written my article or you know, posted my article, but I just thought, I'm not sure I could take this all of the time if, you know, because it just attracts a certain type, but they know what they're doing. I mean, I take the view that I ignore them. I pretend they don't exist, and I do ignore it. But when you have that and have it coming from all sides, like has happened with black female journalists in the UK, quite young ones as well, what they've had to put up with is way, way more than they ought to. Well, no one should have to put up with it, let alone young female journalists of colour who are just trying to make a name for themselves. So it's a really difficult one. You know, you can take legal action, you can go to court, but there are the little things which chip and chip and chip away at you, and it makes you second guess as to what you're going to tweet, what you're going to talk about, what you're going to report on, I'm afraid. And that's the reality of the situation. And I wish that I personally were a little bit braver, and I want to be braver, but I'm not sure I can always take it all. Do you see what I mean?
So I'll just jump in with a very, very quick point, Cassie, on leadership that you mentioned, that it's not enough for our leaders to have these policies in place. It's what helped in the last in the last case that I was talking about in my office was that I'm here as it happens to be me, but an internal ombud is a bridge between that leadership and the people who are most vulnerable. So just having that policy in place meant nothing. This person, I exist there so that I'm a safe place for what I think in Britain you call BAME and we call BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as a safe place for, you know, and hopefully I have relationships of trust. And so they can come to me and I can activate what the policies that leadership is committed to. So it's not enough just to have those policies.
That's actually a really great segue. What I was going to ask, and I think you just gave an excellent example. What are the things, tools, resources, people, practices, formal or informal, that have been in place in the various newsrooms in which you've worked that have helped you succeed in structures that haven't always been equitable, in places that, you know, haven't always been diverse or fostering of a, you know, belonging community?
I know, do you mind if I jump in? I know what I have found helpful for me are mentorships within organizations. Just somebody, this one senior person that you can go and talk to about anything that's bothering you. And that person who then has a direct line to the people really in power. So I think that's a really important structural thing which needs to exist there, especially for young people from groups which are underrepresented in the newsroom, because you can be in a position where, you have very well-meaning colleagues, but who may end up saying or doing things which kind of, betray unconscious bias, which a lot of them don't realize they do. Some do realize, a lot of them don't realize. And you need somewhere that you can go. And also you need a safe space where you can actually raise your concerns without being accused of being a troublemaker. Because I know that colleagues of mine have said that they felt like they were told they were being making a fuss about something because a comment was made which someone else didn't realize how significant that comment was, and they're like, actually this means X, Y, and Z to me because this is my lived experience. So I think it's really important that you've got safe spaces and people you can go to talk about these things. So I think that's really important in terms of when you're actually already in there. I think in terms of getting a more diverse workforce within sort of journalism, it's really important that organizations actually go out and actually find these people. It's not that difficult. If you've got a big organization, I don't know, there's a particular school where, maybe not many of the young people there would necessarily go into journalism just because they don't know how to do it, or they don't know anybody who looks like them who's in journalism. Go into the schools, send your staff into school, invite the young people into the newsroom to let them see how it works, give them a chance to come and spend a little bit of time to see how things go on. Because I think once they actually see you and they see that it's possible, it's something which then piques their interest in their minds. I mean, I go and I do talks in schools and I do talks in universities, and I specifically go to areas where I know there are high proportions of young people who won't necessarily choose journalism, so they can see me and be a little bit shocked. Oh, wow, it's a Black woman and she sounds a little bit like me who's talking about it. So I think those really, really basic things that organizations can do with the will, they can do it, are really, really important in terms of bringing new faces, new ideas and underrepresented groups into journalism.
I have a couple of questions that I want to get see if we can get some answers to, and then I want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time for some questions and answers. I just want to double check that we're using the Q&A function. Is that where folks should be directing questions? I'm guessing yes. All right, so I think I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you think, I'm editorializing this, but how you think the myth of objectivity has impacted the lack of equity and diversity in newsrooms, and kind of a little bit, adjacent to that, how can we be about the business of encouraging a focus on authentic and accurate news instead of the myth of objectivity, that shift in towards authenticity and accuracy and truth, as opposed to that kind of end all be all standard of objectivity?
I'll just real quick say, I can't say I know exactly how I'll get there, but I think one of the things that the myth of objectivity does, and I'll just say it, kind of for the white men or white people who kind of have controlled journalism for the last 400 years, it makes you think that, oh, I don't need someone of a certain community to cover it because I want you to be objective. Anybody can cover it. And sometimes I've actually seen where people want the person who doesn't know anything about something to cover it because they're going to be objective. And if you go to the projects and try to cover this, you're going to get too emotional about it, and you're going to write it with a particular bias. And that may or may not be true, but it also it means that the person who knows nothing doesn't have background information, doesn't know how to talk to people, doesn't know how to get actual true information out of the right people. You might get the one noisy person in the neighborhood who says a bunch of stuff that they don't know what they're talking about, but you're not necessarily going to get that true access. And I've been a traditional journalist for my whole career, so I'm fairly pro objectivity in an ideal world, but it just doesn't exist in reality. And I think that maybe old places need to carve out a place, and maybe it can grow where there can be news that's okay. We're going to admit that this isn't a full editorial, but here's a little bit more of a personalized news style. And then new places are coming along, and at the city, as a nonprofit and as a kind of champion of the people type of place, we try to be objective. We try to tell all sides of the story, but we do bring a lot of kind of knowledge and understanding that sometimes one side of the story is just lying, or we tend to bring a lot of our own, and that's why at the city, for example, we're in New York City. I'm a big fan of people covering the places that they know, that they've grown up in, that they really are in the community, which is what a lot of smaller and ethnic media already does, and which is why you can sometimes get better stories there. Because when people are just kind of parachuting into places, you get half-baked, kind of surface level information about communities.
Can I push back a little bit, Hassani?
Sure.
Because as an immigrant who parachuted into another country, I would have no job at all if we only wanted people from within to write about what they do. So I would say that I know what you're saying about, you have to have that experience. I not entirely pushing back, but I do think it is possible with a certain rigor to get for anybody at all to write a story. But it requires humility, and it requires, a position of actually stepping out and constantly being aware of your place in that social order. And if you don't have that, then you're lost. Then I don't think you can do a good job as a journalist.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this whole idea of objectivity is so, I just call it a pretense. Because even at a time when this would have been framed that journalists must be objective, well, I'm not sure who all had the right to vote, who all had a right in public, who all had a right or who had a say in public affairs when somebody decided that we are going to be objective. So whose objectivity was it, right? And we can't pretend that we are not part of a social order. We don't leave our identities at the door just because we have a recorder in our hands. We may at best be non-partisan. We may think we have no agenda, but at the same time, when it comes to processing the story, then our experiences come into play. When it comes time to presenting the story, which quote are we going to take? Which part are we going to, how are we going to lead our stories? All of that matters. All of our experience comes in, and we try to figure out whom, we all have an image of whom we are writing to. And as long as journalism has been a conversation between white people, that's whom we've always been writing to. And so when I start imagining a Hassani or an Anne or a Cassie in my head as the person that I'm writing to, then I'm going to write it quite differently. I'm going to explain different things than I might if I just had John Doe in my head. And so really, I think the idea of objectivity does a disservice to journalism. We're better off thinking that the idea of both sides does disservice to journalism. We're better off thinking of the multiple perspectives that exist in stories, and being aware that we are constantly making a choice about whose perspective we are valuing. Because we like to talk about being accurate and we like to talk about being truthful, but whose truths and how accurate? Whose level of accuracy are we satisfying at this point?
Just to your first point, it's the thing though, like as immigrants and as people of color, even growing up in America, we always have to understand the white community more than they try to understand. Like it's It's like it's a little easier, or maybe just more natural for an immigrant or a person of color to be like I wouldn't have had a career either. But my first few years in journalism, it was pretty much constantly writing about white people's stuff because I knew them from just, you know, you have to know them, but they don't always do the same work coming to the other side.
It's true. A former colleague of mine who's, you know, what I call a liberal, you know, which in my understanding means you think you're liberal, but you really are not. Once said to me that, she said, Shri, don't be so impatient. You know, these people are trying to, you know, they may not understand your accent. They are trying their best. You know, don't be so impatient about fitting in. They're trying this, they're trying, like, you know, they haven't met people like you before. And we're talking about in Toronto, Canada. And I turned around and I said to her, but I'm adjusting to all of you. You know, you're all adjusting to one of me. So who has to go farther? But the burden comes on me, and I'm not even the most, you know, I have enough proximity to whiteness. Cassie, you were asking earlier, what has advantaged you? My proximity to whiteness has advantaged me. You know, my Brahmin privilege from where I came from has advantaged me.
100%, 100%. Oh man, I have so many more questions. There's a couple of questions in the chat, but before we get there, I wanna ask if this is the kind of like final question. So we're gonna, you know, step back and think pretty big here. But if our industry is successful at making progress, because it's not a box, it's not a set of boxes that we get to check off, right? It's not, we do this, and this, ergo equity, right? That's not how it works. And I think humility is a big part of that. Humility means that you understand that there's always work to be done. There's always progress to be made, right? And so I want to preface this by saying I realize that, but if we are to make progress as an industry, you know, over the next 5 to 10 years, what do structures look like when they are more equitable, when you know, audiences are being better served by news and information, when women and people of color, you know, feel not just more supported, but have like real legitimate access to leadership opportunities, to, you know, when pay gaps are decreased. What is the product, right? What is the result of all of that? How does that change what journalism actually means, what it does, and who it serves?
I think it has to be when we're no longer surprised to see a woman or a Black person in charge, or when it no longer deserves or elicits comment when you have maybe 2 co-presenters who happen to be Asian, or who both of them happen to be Black, presenting a particular news program. When we're talking about stories which, you know, maybe impact people from certain communities, like the Black community. I'll give you an example with the whole COVID. It was referred to at the beginning of this chat, the COVID pandemic. It was clear within 2 or 3 weeks of people starting to get ill and dying that there were a whole heap of Black and brown people who were dying from COVID, literally one after the other. And this is picked up on very, very quickly by Black journalists who obviously looked and thought, hang on, that person looks like me, that person looks like me. So it's when you're doing stories like that, which isn't just about, oh, it just affects Black people, we're not too bothered. It's just a story which just affects everybody and everybody cares about it. And for me, that's when it will feel that things have really, really changed, when it's no longer a surprise to have a story that's leading the news, which is mainly featuring Black people. It's just a story which everybody cares about and everyone's invested in. And yeah, that is my hope for, you know, the years to come. And it does feel like this year has been a real, you know, like it does feel like it's been a turning point. I think we've got this amazing opportunity from this awful tragedy to really build and to improve things. And I'm really hoping that the things that we've seen happen this year aren't just flashes in the pan, and that we can continue to build on what we've already established in this short few months of this weird, crazy year that has been 2020, with all the tragedy, but also the joy as well.
Yeah, when we're not talking about the first Black this, the first Black photo editor of Vogue magazine, it's like, what? It's 2020. More Black editors, more Black producers, more Black presenters, more Black experts, or not just Black, more experts of color, because that's one of the things. You'll have a story about, Black infant mortality, but then it's just a bunch of, white PhDs and doctors talking about it. Yeah, I think, lack of surprise, more pipeline, more, more, majority minority schools getting access, like you said, more, mentorship, more people in the newsroom that other people of color can turn to, so there's not just one person who has to be the, the counselor for every single young Black journalist in the room. Just more. And, as I told you, Cassie, in the email, it's like, we're also in a society that is completely full of systemic racism. I don't know if journalism alone is going to turn the tide. We need academia, we need, entertainment media is a huge part of it, education. So maybe I'm a little cynical too.
For me, very quickly, I'd say decolonize newsrooms using principles of decolonization, where we are sharing power with, not jostling for supremacy. With Black and Indigenous leadership would be ideal. And also not just having brown and Black faces in white spaces, but wouldn't it be great? I think my idea of an equitable place would be if we were able to critique Black art, Asian art or whatever, not from a place of looking down and a racist point of view, but because you actually have the in-house expertise to do it, and so I think, to me, that would be a great sign of all of us having moved forward.
Thank you very much. On that note, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. If you have questions for our panelists today, you can go ahead and chat them. There are two that I'm going to combine because it is appropriate to do that. One question: how can readers and audiences support newsrooms as they work to become more equitable? Is there anything tangible that readers can do? The second is, what can governments do? So I would ask you all, you can, pick one or feel free to address both.
I was going to say one thing about readers, and this is going to sound quite controversial, because we've reached a point where with journalism now where people have got used to this model where you can just get journalism for free. Go back 20 years ago, you'd happily go to the newsagents and you buy your newspaper, you'd spend your 20 pence, whatever it was back then, to get your newspaper. Now, because everything got dumped online and everything was free online, people think that journalism is free. Good journalism costs money. So what I would say, what the public can probably do to help, if you know there's a good organization that does good journalism, subscribe to their news organization. Buy their newspaper. Don't just expect to get it for free. Like, we have some newspapers in the UK, like I think the Times is behind a paywall. You have to pay for that, and people are always complaining that, why is this article behind a paywall? Because it costs money to do proper journalism. So if you appreciate what news organisations are doing, if they're doing the right thing, and if they're progressive, and they're giving a voice to diverse voices, pay for it and leave the other stuff which you don't think is doing its job properly. So I think that's probably one simple thing that the public can do. And I know it's difficult to accept that you have to pay for news, but it does cost money to do your job properly.
I would add moral support. We get a lot of angry emails and a lot of complaints. And I think if the public, whatever color the public is and whatever color the writer or presenter of the story is, if you see something in the story, you're like, yeah, you know what, I like that. That did it right. That was good. I want more of that. Like, write them and say that. Or if you see a story that, maybe the perspective, you think there's something that they should have mentioned that would have been more relevant to people of color, the community, write that. I think, and also I think readers could, not that I want readers to come out and be the Avengers for anybody, but if you're a person on Twitter and you see a Black or a female journalist or journalist of color being harassed, maybe step up and say something. I'm not, I don't want people to take bullets for us or anything, but you know, we get so much negativity because people who are positive about something usually just read it, think, oh, that was great, and then go on their merry way. But it'd be nice if the people who really are supporting or who have positive things to say would be a little bit more vocal sometimes.
Yeah, just to add to that, you know, of course, subscribe and be vocal and positive, but also maybe write to the, you know, the senior editors, you know, write to the editor-in-chief if there's a journalist of color that you particularly appreciate, and make senior management, make it known to senior management that, you know, you appreciate them. Also, if you know of something going on in your own neighborhoods that you think requires attention, then maybe organize a little bit and have 2 or 3 people send those emails to an editor-in-chief to you know, bring the situation to their attention, so that you're not just responding to PR and to advocacy groups, but actually grassroots concerns.
I'm curious about philanthropy and the role of philanthropic institutions. I think it's something that we pay close attention to at Resolve, and seeing you know, some large chunks of change going to some large news institutions to do work in this space, right? To do work that addresses diversity and equity and inclusion. And I think, you know, sometimes it's in the form of coverage that, you know, kind of meets specific editorial criteria. And sometimes it's in the form of training, really subsidizing, you know, audits, content audits, source audits, et cetera. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts as to how philanthropy can better support or support differently, or things that philanthropy should continue to do to support equity in journalism.
I think one thing that could really help is in terms of philanthropy is actually helping young journalists with training, you know, at the beginning. I know that when I was looking to go into journalism, and we're going back 20 odd years ago now, and it was going to cost me something like £6,000 to do my journalism training. I just left university, I was in debt, hadn't got any money. The thought of having to spend that kind of money to train to be a journalist just made me feel sick. I mean, as it was, I was very, very lucky, and I got on an in-house training scheme with a local newspaper, and they paid for my training. So I think, you know, if you do have philanthropy, invest in training so you actually have really good, well, talented young people, but invest in them so they actually become really, really talented, really, really great journalists, and they'll be in a really good position to continue the tradition of holding power to account. So I think that's a really important way in that philanthropy can help. And also that takes the philanthropy away from any sort of editorial control. So I'm always slightly worried about philanthropy kind of like given directly to news organizations, but I think giving it to individuals who are talented and letting them just then find their own path, that's what I would like to see more of if someone's in the position to help in that way.
And also, I think, and I, you know, kind of a benefit of this, but I think a lot of philanthropical minded people and organizations are often like, okay, what new thing can we do? But are not taking into effect that there's hundreds of already, you know, Black and other people of color owned organizations or run organizations that are struggling and that could really use the money. And I remember when I first started the city, I had just gotten to nonprofit, and I was just looking at, I was literally looking at like the Forbes billionaire list. And, you know, one of our major guys who gave us the most money and was kind of empowered us for the first couple of years, I was like, he's number 400 on the list. Like, what about all these other guys? You know, like there's so much money out there where they could just give like a fraction of their net worth and empower an organization for 10 years. And I don't think that's really talked about a lot. And when they do start something new, or when they do give the money, if they are thinking more about the structure and the makeup of the team, because they're the ones who have the real power in the beginning, that could go a long way, as opposed to them just, you know, hiring a white guy who hires all his friends.
I'm also very leery of philanthropy as a model of development, but I get that it has a role to play in the promotion of certain you know, ideologies that we might have, or certain frameworks that we would like to have. I would just say, if philanthropy has the funds and the industry is struggling, then the philanthropic organization has the power. So then if you're going to release some funds, either for training staff, making anti-Black racism training mandatory for staff, or to support scholarships for young students, then make it also conditional to organizations that will have a certain number of BIPOC representation in its leadership. And so now that gives an incentive to news organizations to make sure that they're actually represented.
On that super tactical, very practical piece of structural equity advice, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. Guests from the United States, from Canada, and from Britain. I don't know if I'm closing it out. Oh gosh, I didn't even look at the thing, or if I'm kicking it over to somebody else, but I know I'm supposed to stop at 2:15. Yeah, no, I think
Yeah, the program says just you at 2:15.
just me. All right then. Friends, thanks so much for joining us. Follow Twitter if you're on Twitter. There's some great journalism being produced by my 3 guests today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.